First order of business is the joke. Who's got it? Preferably funny, no shock words. Shall I call on people at random? You have a guilty look on your face. Do you have a joke ready? You're going to steal her joke. Okay. Here's a stolen joke about sex.
Why did the sperm cross the road?
Why did the sperm cross the road?
So I put on the wrong sock this morning.
All right. Just trying to make sure I understand fully. It's that the ejaculate was so forceful it went across the road. Okay. No, that's not the point of the joke. Because there was no sock to catch it. I'm sorry. Oh, he put on the right and wore it across the road. I like my version better. Because it reminds me of Portnoy's complaint, where he talks about it as an adolescence, where if you haven't read it, where he's constantly trying to see when he masturbates in the bathroom, can he reach the light bulbs? I don't remember if he ever manages it or not. Okay, there's your dose of gross for the day. Hardly the last. So last time we were talking about kinds of reproductive systems that are out there in nature, and we had, after having talked about sexual selection, and we'd gotten as far as talking about how in the wild, most mating systems that one encounters in the wild are, I guess we'd just gone over them, and that polygamy is much more common than monogamy in the animal kingdom. Doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just the nature of things. And I'll remind you, we can't look to nature to tell us what people ought to do. And so monogamy has to do with a couple staying together for some extended period, maybe a season, maybe longer. Polygamy is when there's more than one partner. The most common kind of polygamy is polygyny, where some men have many partners. And it's much more common than polyandry, where some women have many partners, but most men have only one. And we made the distinction between social monogamy and sexual monogamy. And it turns out sexual monogamy is even more rare than we thought before, because some of those cases where the animal pair stayed together for a long period of time, and I'm thinking mostly of bird species, that occasionally there were what's known in the literature as extra pair copulations, which meant that they were socially monogamous, but not strictly speaking, sexually monogamous. And we'd gotten as far as talking about this red deer who has been busy inseminating all of these females. And yeah. What does that mean? And here I thought you people had imagination. 58 seconds. Well, there was a picture of a big male red deer, stag, enormous antlers. And since they get bigger each year, he's been at this a while, and he survived a while, and he's surrounded by a bevy of does who are all either pregnant with his offspring or shortly going to be, and he will vigorously defend wherever those females are by chasing off other males. It used to be, people thought that the male always succeeded and that all the offspring were indeed his. We now know that occasionally some of the does may wander off and gather semen somewhere else because some of the offspring are known to be fathered by someone else. But for the most part, most of those does are going to carry his offspring. Questions about that? And I'll point out to you again, this means that most male deer don't have any mates this season, and most of them won't have any mates any season, even if they live long enough. And this particular male, he's in a particularly favored spot for such congregations to happen. And it's not elect because he's the only male in this area, but he fought vigorously, fought off other males to be there. Eventually, this male will grow old, and eventually a male will come and challenge him and supplant him. And once that happens, that season, it's going to be a new father for all those offspring, if the new male can keep them, because when that happens, there's always lots of upheaval and there's lots of vying for a chance. Questions about that? Good. Uh-huh.
How long do you have to be with like one person to that consider?
Yeah, I mean, how long do they have to be together as a pair to count as a pair bond? And it kind of varies by species, but for the most part, most biologists would say if they stay together one breeding season, they've been monogamous. But in most of the species, they are not monogamous. They don't keep the same partners year after year, though there are plenty of species where they do. And, things happen. They successfully had a clutch of birds this year. The male gets killed in the migration. Coming back, she's back in the market. She'll have another pair bond, and it'll be relatively lasting for that season. So this is an instance of polygamy, specifically of polygyny. And of course, this is not unknown in human populations. So here's a gentleman with his many wives and some of his many children. So this happens to be a member of a Mormon sect that broke away from the main body of Mormonism, Church of Latter-day Saints, long ago. And there are some sects where SECTS, where this practice is still smiled upon. It is, of course, illegal, partly, first of all, in the eyes of the law, he's married to only one of these women, right? It's in the eyes of his religion that the others are his wives. And I won't go into a long history of polygamy, which was really polygyny, in the Church of Latter-day Saints. We know a lot about it because it arose in the 19th century, and there are court records and documents and newspaper accounts at the time. You may know that the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, was eventually arrested, and then a mob came and pulled him out of the jail and killed him, I think hung him. At the time that happened, most of the other church elders were in Boston, including Brigham Young, whom you might have heard of. At the time that he was lynched, it was not widely known that some men in the Mormon church had already begun practicing polygamy. He, in fact, had several wives, but it was a closely guarded secret. And back in Boston, Brigham Young also had several wives already, and it would be a while before this news about polygamy was out there. So Smith's killing had nothing to do with polygamy, right? Because nobody knew it. None of the people that were in the mob. He was very unpopular because he and his church would go to particular counties or townships and start voting, and the people that were already there always worried about these newcomers coming and outvoting them, et cetera. So that could happen. Questions about that? Eventually they go to Utah, yes? Pardon? I don't remember. But it wasn't a hanging offense, I can assure you of that. And eventually they moved to Utah, where they openly practiced polygamy, which was still a crime. But when the Civil War comes, the federal government has a lot more things on its mind than worrying about, people practicing polygamy in Utah. And so it persisted, and I think it was the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the main church decided we got to get rid of polygamy. We got to stop doing that because sooner or later, we're going to have problems with the federal government. And so it was announced that it was no longer an accepted practice, and that was when many sects broke off because they wanted to continue that. in these places, these communities where this sort of polygamy still goes on, they tend to be on border states, between two states, so that people can quickly move from one jurisdiction to another. And there are the consequences of this are all the same consequences that you see in red deer, right? If one man has exclusive access to lots of women, that means there are lots of men that won't have access to wives at all. And what happens in these communities, the reason the practice is illegal is because almost always the new brides who are not legally married to anyone are almost always underage, under the age of consent, when they get taken to be someone's wife. And the way the system really works is the men collaborate and say, you can take my 13-year-old daughter to bed now if you let me take your daughter to bed when she's 13. And they agree on this, and so that's what happens. So it's statutory rape, and many of these children are the product of statutory rape, but it's been, exceedingly difficult to arrange. Well, if they're swapping daughters, what about their sons? The sons, are raised, and by the time they reach adolescence, they're shunned, they're thrown out, and they're on their own, mostly homeless, and they tend to congregate in big cities because that's the easiest place to be homeless, and they have to make their own way in the world. Questions about that? And it's probably, yeah. Or comments about that? Yeah, good. Pardon? Oh, an interesting Netflix documentary called Keeps. Okay. Yeah. And someone, HBO had a really pretty charming series about a family that was practicing polygamy in Utah, and it was all very sweet and nice. And in that case, all the wives, there were 3 wives, they had all consented to be part of this when they were adults, right? And so, but that's not the way it's typically done. Not saying that it isn't done, but so you can think about what it's like to grow up to become an adolescent girl in that community when all you've known all your lives is that you have lots of mothers and you're expected to become someone's wife soon. Yeah, okay, enough about that. So he's got big antlers too. And of course, it can be done legally in the sense that there's nothing illegal about a man having multiple partners. Legally in the United States, he can only be married to one at a time. And Elon Musk is sort of famous for, he has plenty of money, so he supports various women. I have no idea what the relationship is like between him and them, but he has various women around the nation that I'm sure he keeps in comfort who have his babies for him. And, no one's in any position to say whether that's right or wrong. Everybody's consenting adults, right? So, but you can give some thought to this, which also applies in the case of the Mormon gentleman before, or any time when there's a large number of children. So there are various celebrities who are famous for having, 13, 17 children, right? There's a consequence to that you need to realize, which is when you have that many children, each one is not going to get very many resources. If you're Elon Musk, you got plenty of money resources, but how much of the parents' time do they get? And so if you think a child having access to their parents' attention, if you think that's a valuable thing for a child to have, anytime anyone has lots of children, there's got to be some sacrifice made there. And yeah. And I can't say that it can't be made to work or that this has never worked. And then I couldn't resist. So I believe this is photoshopped. I don't believe it's a real show. What happens in cases of polygyny, which is far and away the most common kind of polygamy in either humans or other species, is that, and this happens to be based on women, that in places where polygamy is practiced, there is a lot more variation in the number of children carried by men in a polygynous society than a monogamous. But of course, there are fewer men having children. But the thing I want you to see here is how much bigger the error bars here, because it is a zero-sum game. Any man who gets 7 wives, that's 7 fewer women on the market for other men to have as their wives. And in these societies, there's no reason to think that this isn't a matter of persuading the women which group to join. Yeah. Also notice, however, that in these polygynous society, women have more children than in the United States, but of course, contraception and things like that are much more available to women in the United States. So the difference in the average between women isn't probably significant beyond that. But the point is, there's a lot more variation for reproductive success of men in that society than in others. And it's not unusual among mammalian species for the males to have some sort of ritualized combat where they fight over access to females. Elephant seals are famous for this. They also have a harem on the beach, and they fight quite viciously, and plenty of blood. Rarely is one of the males crippled or killed, though it does happen. Lions are another instance where males have to fight fiercely. And there's an aspect of lion sexual behavior that's very well established now. It was controversial once upon a time, but it's really quite clear now. So a male lion with his beautiful, handsome, dark beard may be the king of the pride for a while, inseminating lots of females, chasing away other males. Eventually, of course, he grows old, grows weak, and some other male challenges him, and he loses. I think this is meant to show, an old lion being chased off by a young one. In any case, it does happen. And as another instance of how we don't look to nature to tell us how we should behave, in those cases, the first thing the male does is kill as many of the cubs as he can get a hold of. Because as long as there are cubs, especially if they're lactating, as long as the females are lactating, they can't get pregnant again. And so he will vigorously kill as many of the cubs as he can. The females, the mothers, tend to try to resist him, but it's really no contest. And that means that she'll quickly ovulate again, about which more later, and that means he can start getting her pregnant with his offspring. Questions about that? You might be tempted to think of this just a matter of brawn, who's biggest, who's got the longest claws, who has the most, the boldest moves, etc. But it's in fact a fairly complicated social situation. And one of the things that will sometimes happen is that 2 males will gang up on an existing male, displace him, and take his place. And when this happens, the 2 males are almost always brothers. So it can sometimes happen that there can be this allegiance between 2 males to displace the old male and start producing their offspring. And this is a case of inclusive fitness, where each of the males is helping spread their genes, not by having the offspring themselves, but by having someone who shares their genes having offspring. And we'll talk about that soon. There are a few species where it's the males who do most of the work rearing, and in that case, it's the females who are gaudy, and they're the ones that compete to, to get a male to pay attention to them and stay with them and raise their clutch when it happens. So, sex reversals do happen. And in general, there's this idea that promiscuity is something that males practice and females don't. And across the animal kingdom, that's more often true than not. That is, that the males are much more likely to be promiscuous. But evolutionary theorists have noticed, first of all, that in those supposedly monogamous species, sometimes the females have extra pair copulations, that there might be times when it's a good idea for the female to play the field a little bit. When is it a good idea to stick with one male and have only his offspring? And when is it a good idea to maybe instead gather offspring from a few other fathers in order to do well in the future? And this is a complicated experiment that's described in the book, and I won't go into it a whole lot. But the point is that they're looking at here mean number of offspring produced by males and females. So in this population, when there's plenty of food, the females, pretty much have the same number of offspring, no matter how many partners they have. Whether they have one partner, two partners, three partners, they'll have about the same number of offspring. So there's no advantage of playing the field, gathering diversity in your offspring, if everything's hunky-dory. In these situations, of course, the males who have the most partner have the most offspring, right? The more chance they get to copulate, the more likely they have offspring. That's simple. Things get interesting when you deliberately underfeed the fruit flies. And in those situations, it turns out, again, for males, it's a simple linear progression. The more females they mate with, the better they'll do. But in this case, when things are tough, females who gather more sperm have more offspring survive them, suggesting that when things are tough, it might be, when conditions are not terribly suitable, it might be a good idea to gather genes from more than one source in order to ensure the survival of your offspring, which is pretty much reminiscent of aphids, where they will reproduce without sexually reproducing, no gametes required, as long as they get plenty to eat. But once conditions get bad, suddenly they start wanting to trade gametes with other individuals. And of course, I'm not suggesting they actually want anything. It's just natural selection has given them genes that make them more likely to sexually reproduce when they can see that conditions are not going well. Questions about that? Good. Say it again. Absolutely. So it's also true, of course, that if there's plenty of resources, there'll be more offspring survive. And so here they're deliberately, controlling for that. So same amount of resources for everybody, but some females got 3 partners and some got 1. Is that? These are fruit flies, so they can't do that. They're stuck with sex. Poor things. And I apologize, going back and forth between aphids and fruit flies. I didn't make that clear. Okay, and given that females natural selection may favor the accumulation of genes in females that make them seek other partners, especially when times are tough, you can imagine that natural selection would also favor genes that have males behave in such a way as to try to put a clamp on that. Right? And indeed, there are loads of mechanisms by which males try to combat female promiscuity. And among them are, the most common is mate guarding. So in those Hamadryas baboons I showed you, where the males are big silver-backed males and the females have those swellings, as the various females come into estrus, that is, they're going to be ovulating soon, they're going to be able to get pregnant soon, the male will spend a lot more time around them and won't really allow them to get very far away. And that's common in lots of species where Often the female may give some cues that she's going to be fertile soon. And in those cases, males, their best way of keeping her from being promiscuous is first copulate with her and then chase her around. Sound familiar? Right? Stalk her to make sure if other males come close, then you shoo them off. And then there's infanticide, which I talked about. So it's not just lions, but there are also primate species, Hanuman langurs, where it's very well documented. When a new alpha male takes over a troop, the first thing he does is grab as many of the babies as he can and kill them, despite the protests of their mothers. And pretty soon they're ready to get pregnant again. Then there are sperm plugs, which you might not have heard of, particularly common among rodents and lots of insect species, where the male will eventually persuade the female to let him deposit his semen. And in the semen, first there's a slug of sperm, and behind that is some viscous globby stuff that is meant to seal up the canal. So if other males come around, they're not going to be able to get their semen up, to the important place. A subsequent male may ejaculate and leave his own sperm plug there, but if the first male's plug is in the way, the sperm have no chance of getting to the eggs. Everyone see that? Yeah. The plug absolutely goes away with time. In the case of rats, for example, it'll the female will eventually dislodge it, even if she's by herself. But if she's not, it may come out sooner. Interestingly, in rats, since the post-ejaculatory interval, how long between ejaculations male can do, in male rats, sorry, don't want to make anyone feel jealous, but it's maybe 6-7 minutes, something like that. And in rat sexual behavior, we'll talk about it. Don't stop that. We'll talk about it in more detail later. But in that case, even if it's the same male, you might think there's a problem. Well, in rat sexual behavior, the first few times the male puts his penis inside the female, he doesn't ejaculate. But what he does do is he has an erection that brings out barbed devices on the head of his penis that are there to grab any copulatory plug that got put there before him. And so, in fact, it takes 3 or 4 intromissions before the plug will be dislodged. And guess what? He won't ejaculate until, 3 or 4 intromissions later. Well, that's in the case of just one male. But you can see the first male copulates, leaves a plug, another male comes along, he doesn't ejaculate instantly. The first thing he does is have his intromissions so as to make sure there's a clearing of the canal so that his sperm will have a chance. How's that? We'll talk about that in more detail, more than you probably want later, but it's not. But the point is, that's one way in which males can combat female promiscuity, and of course, they're also competing with one another. The other thing to do is to just flood the market. So there's lots of kinds of sperm competition where the natural selection has favored males if they can produce a lot of semen, a lot. So like in boars, right? They'll put out a pint of semen in ejaculation, 2 cups, right? So if there are any other boars' sperm in there ahead of them, flush them out, get rid of them, and make your own mark. This compared to a tablespoon in men. And also, of course, look how many more in boars, where there's this intense sperm competition going on. Each ejaculate may have close to 1 trillion sperm, compared to men with a mere 1/3 of a billion or so. So you can then gauge how much male-male competition there are in species if you compare how big their testes are in terms of how much semen it can produce, how much sperm it can produce, more specifically, and compared to their body weight. So if all you needed was enough semen to reproduce, then across species, you'd expect all the species to fall in this line. Because if there's no male-male competition, then there's no reason, to produce bigger testes and therefore produce more semen. But you'll see there's some species, including chimpanzees, that are well above the line. That means chimpanzees, given their body size, they have bigger testes than, say, humans. Gorillas, on the other hand, given their body size, have smaller testes than you'd expect from body size alone. And that tells you there's a lot of sperm competition and a lot of male-male competition among chimpanzees, and there's no male-male competition among gorillas. There tends to be a silverback male, and he doesn't seem to be all that unhappy if one of the other males copulates with a female. Yeah. In older men, when there's swelling of the testes, that's pathological. There's a problem. Pardon? There's several different things can be going on, and one is to make sure it's not testicular cancer, about which more later, but odds are it's just edema. Yeah. And in this, the other reason I'm pointing this out to you is this suggests that in humans, male-male competition isn't that fierce. Or at the very least, competition between men has nothing to do with flushing out the vagina and having lots of semen, right? Or making lots of sperm. So this is one of those curious graphs that the more you look at it, the more interesting it is. And we spared you talking about naming all the species, but these are all mammals. Another reproductive strategy to combat female promiscuity is rape. And it was controversial for a while, but I think the field has now accepted that in some species, rape, it doesn't just happen, but that it's common. And among familiar species, the cases of species you might know about is, I told you lots of bird species are monogamous, right? People think of swans, for example, and various species of geese. But ducks are different. It's pretty clearly documented that male ducks, if they have a chance, can overpower and rape a female. It's somewhat controversial. We assume that it's not what she wants because she's trying to get away from him and she's vocalizing, etc. But I think the consensus is, yeah, that rape does happen in that species and in other species. It's easier to see and easier to perhaps accept in insect species where the males will, physically restrain the female and force their semen upon them. The details of how semen gets transferred in insects is quite different, but it still happens. And the other thing that's interesting about the fact that ducks can achieve rape and other bird species, it doesn't. There's another difference between ducks and most other bird species. Does anyone know what it is? Having to do with sex. Well, number one, their penis is shaped like a corkscrew, but full stop. They have a penis. Most birds don't, right? As we'll see when we talk about anatomy, in most bird species, the male just has a cloaca, just like the female, cloaca being one opening for both urine and feces and sex. So most bird species have no intermittent organ. So the fact that ducks do suggests that this strategy of rape was, was favored at some point in their evolution. And so it's still clearly present there. What are the other bird species that do have an intermittent organ, a real penis? I'll give you a hint. There's one found in Africa and one found in South America and one found in Australia. There's the so-called ratites, ostriches, emus, what's the one in, pardon? No, the turkeys don't have a penis. Not cassowaries. Anyway, I can't think, rheas, thanks, in South America. These are species that have such long legs, and they run fast. So they all have, the males of those species, they have penises, because you have to if you're going to have any chance to inseminate someone that tall, probably. Okay. And again, I'm going to remind you that just because rape happens in nature, that doesn't mean it's natural for us, or that we should necessarily want to do that. And another example of how you can't look to nature for what one ought to do. This is one of my favorite examples. If you've had a garden, you've probably seen caterpillars like this. If you've raised tomatoes, you saw those green caterpillars with a horn at the end of the tip who are eating your tomato leaves. And every once in a while, you'll see one with big white things sticking out like this. These are eggs of a wasp that has laid her eggs in the caterpillar. They'll hatch right there where the skin meets the egg, then enter the caterpillar and start eating it from the inside, slowly, eating it, leaving the circulatory system for last. And the caterpillar is eating furiously, trying to gain some weight. And the whole time it's getting eaten from the inside. Just, your everyday parasitic species. There's lots of them. So this caterpillar, I feel confident that insects feel pain. I'm sure this caterpillar is having a horrible life, in excruciating pain, but natural selection doesn't care. Natural selection only cares about what arranges for the individual to have offspring. Who gets hurt in the meantime, natural selection has no way of taking that into account, right? So there's no morality in natural selection. It's just, and it's true for you too, which is that in humans, things that evolved in order to increase the chance of reproduction might happen whether the person is happy or not, right? Because natural selection can't select for only happy offspring. All it can select for is offspring. And likewise, it can't select for happy parents or unhappy parents. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, Anna. Yeah.
The birds we previously mentioned that had phalluses, do they also exhibit rape behaviors?
As far as I know, no. I mean, for those ratite species, the ostrich-like animals, there's a very elaborate courtship, which is why male ostriches are black and white and have those huge feathers that women in Europe went crazy for in fashion. Yeah, Gab.
I think female ducks, they can choose like which sperm they.
Well, yes. So another thing that can happen is some species, the female can choose to eject sperm that they didn't like. And that's one strategy to try to work against rape. Though you could say for the male, if you don't buy a lottery ticket, there's no way you can win, right? So that doesn't discourage them, but it's one way for females to combat that. And there are lots of species, including plenty of bird species, where the female may have several partners and she may decide to eject some sperm, not others. Later, we'll get to, there are lots of species where the female can store sperm for astonishingly long periods of time. And among insects and fish and lizards, et cetera. And these are all ways in which she can control her destiny, by which I mean natural selection has favored mechanisms that allow the female to choose the best pathway to leave children and grandchildren. So from the dark stuff, let's get to the nicer stuff, because it does sometimes happen that altruism does happen. Altruism is when one individual sacrifices something for the benefit of another individual. And people have seen altruistic behavior, lots. Certainly well before Darwin, people would see and report and talk about instances where one animal seemed to take a risk for the sake of other animals. And this led to a lot of talk about preservation of the species, that, that natural selection somehow got animals to show behaviors that would keep the species going. And that attitude pretty quickly got dismissed in the mid-20th century because, first of all, how would natural selection know, what behavior would be good for the species? The modern view is that every animal's behavior is a product of genes that have accumulated to maximize its chance of leaving offspring behind. And, if that ends up preserving the species, fine, but if it doesn't, no one individual, there's no way for natural selection to say, you got to have an offspring now because otherwise the species might disappear. It's absurd. And the alternative explanation soon became apparent, which is when altruistic behavior happens, it's much more likely to happen if the animal that's making the sacrifice is related to the animal that's going to benefit. So in prairie dog systems, for example, in prairie dog communities, where if there's a snake or a hawk, they'll have different vocalizations to alert individuals. Hey, there's a hawk overhead. Hey, there's a snake moving around. And it turns out the prairie dogs are much more likely to make those vocalizations if they've got some relatives around. If there are no relatives around, they may keep mum. And so you can see that this would be a way of helping your relatives. And natural selection would favor that because if you have genes that make you more likely to help relatives than others, some of those relatives are carrying that gene and therefore you'll benefit. So even though your cousin's offspring over there, they're not your offspring, but they'll have a share of your genes. And so natural selection would favor the accumulation of genes that favor altruistic behavior for the sake of relatives. Because and in that situation, the prairie dog is just some sneaky gene's way of making a mechanism to help other copies of that sneaky gene replicate. Okay, that was too far. Go back. So, so it turns out that natural selection can favor anything that helps your relatives to reproduce. The other example in humans you can think about, and we'll return to this later, is that uncle who never has children themselves, but is the great uncle and really looks after their niece and nephews. Those nieces and nephews carry his genes. And so natural selection would favor that sort of behavior as a way for his genes to be represented in the next gene pool. Yeah.
How far would the inclusive fitness extend? Because I can understand animals can obviously easily understand their sibling mates, but at what point would they how would they know that they're their cousin?
So there are two great questions in there, but let me back up and say that the term you just used for these sort of traits that increase one's total contribution to the next gene pool, including through offspring other than your own, is known as inclusive fitness. That if you really want to measure the fitness of an individual in terms of how many genes they'll have in the next gene pool, you want to look not just at how many offspring they have, but how many offspring they arrange for their relatives to have. So that would be inclusive fitness as opposed to mere fitness or ordinary fitness. And the two questions you ask that are very astute is, well, they both have to do, how would that work? And number one is that for that to work, the individual would have to have some way of knowing who's a relative and who's not. And one sure cue that you brought up, absolutely. If you are raised together, odds are, you know that you at least share a mother. And so individuals you've grown up with share your genes. So to get back to that pair of male lions, the brothers who take over a pride, I don't think they know anything about genes or anything about a brother, but natural selection would favor them making an alliance with someone they'd grown up with, because that individual is likely to share their genes. But there are plenty of other species where sometimes they're really good at knowing who the relatives are. So in frogs, for example, people have shown that you can you can grind up one frog and expose several tadpoles to it, right? And those tadpoles who are exposed to a frog that was, to the remains of a frog that was related to it, are more likely to show altruistic behavior. They're more likely to share food sources. So natural selection has come up with some system for them to tell who they're related to and who they're not. And among mammals, it's been shown repeatedly that there are lots of mammals where odor and pheromones are very important, where even if they haven't been raised together, the animals do know if another animal is related to them. In extreme cases, they might avoid mating with a full sib, for example. But in other cases, they can tell them apart. And so natural selection would have this mechanism of saying, be altruistic to that individual, not that individual. And I always loved this idea, JBS Haldane, I would gladly give up my life, right, for 2 brothers, 4 half-brothers, or 8 cousins. Because if you save 8 cousins, you will have sent as many of your genes in the next generation's gene pool as if you'd had a kid yourself. Everyone get that? But you gotta help 4 half sibs and 2 full sibs to break even. So even though you die, your genes go on. And the idea is that natural selection would favor the accumulation of genes that would favor that kind of behavior. And another famous example, there are bird species, typically in difficult situations like deserts of Mexico, where it's really hard to raise a clutch. And so there's some species, Mexican jays were the ones that are most famous, where the first batch of eggs that hatch, those fledglings won't try to mate themselves. Rather, they'll stick around and help feed their brothers that come in a second clutch of eggs. And that can be understood as a case of inclusive fitness, where the altruism it's still altruistic in terms of the individuals, but it is evolutionarily favored. It is a way of increasing your contribution to the next gene pool. And perhaps the best at kin selection are the Hymenoptera, ants and bees, where a beehive, most of the individuals in the beehive never reproduce. They can't. They're physically unable to do so. But that hive will occasionally produce sexually reproducing queens. And I won't go into the details of it, but because of the peculiarities of genetics in bees, the queen bees that a hive makes shares 3/4, not half, but 3/4 of its genes with those workers. So when the workers sting you and you scrape them off and they die, they never were going to reproduce, but to the extent they keep you from destroying the hive, they will have, we don't have a word for it. They're not a half sib, not a full sib. They'll have queens that share 3/4 of their genes who will make a hive somewhere else someday. Yeah, Nick. Are there instances of cross-species altruism? There are, and they're somewhat controversial, and perhaps the most famous are, except they've been with us for so long, there are loads of anecdotes about men at sea, typically men at sea, being helped by dolphins, right? And there are also anecdotes of whales interfering with orcas, hunting down the young of other species of whales. And there's not a lot known about it, but you could imagine that probably takes quite a bit of cognitive power for individuals to do that sort of thing. And it may have nothing to do with genes favoring altruism, right? Or it may be a situation where the species have accumulated genes that favor altruism, but they're applying it broadly.
At least like the whales getting the orcas away, it
Yep.
kind of makes sense because if like the orcas end up starving, then they can't kill their calves.
Yeah, Matt? Ian, sorry. Ian's point is, that's not so altruistic. Wait a minute. To the extent the orcas don't do well, that's good for your future offspring. And that's the sort of thinking that always happens when you talk about inclusive fitness. And I'm not going to argue about, is it really altruistic to help your close relatives, or is it selfish? Well, at the level of the individuals, we're still going to call it altruism. You help that individual, otherwise he would have died, right? And so that was altruism. But maybe you have a sneaky ulterior motive, and I'm going to go ahead and call the behavior altruistic. But plenty of people say, yeah, there's no such thing as altruistic behavior. It's all carefully calculated by evolution. And then in humans, of course, we're talking about nepotism, totally common. And yeah. So how many of you have a favorite uncle, one that spent the most time with you? Hands high. How many? I mean, families are smaller now, so no, keep them high. I want to get some. Okay. And of those, how many of you, keep your hands up, how many of you, it was your mother's brother? And now the other way, how many of you, it was your dad's brother? Oh, isn't that interesting? So it's like they tend to be maternal uncles. Huh. And those are the ones that almost certainly share genes with you. Because who knows who your dad is, but you know who your mom is. And likewise for your uncle, you know, his brother's children may or may not be related to him, but his sister's kids are related. So maybe they're not, so maybe they're really having an ulterior motive. They're just being nice to you to get your genes out there. I don't think so. Hannah? Pardon?
What about being super close?
What about being super close to cousins? I see. I'm so tempted just to josh with you. I have no explanation for that. There, straight answer. We'll talk later about no, not now. And we'll talk about when we talk about the origins of homosexual attraction. We'll talk about the fact that gay men tend to have more nieces and nephews than straight men. Why is that? And in terms of nepotism, I'm not much of a sports guy, but it's like, why is it when the Olympics come, we're supposed to root for the Americans? Are they guaranteed to be the nicest, most deserving? No, and yet it's almost impossible to watch them and not root for whatever country you're from. Nepotism. I already said that. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. And there is a species that's famous for showing lots of altruistic behaviors, and that's this distinction between regular chimpanzees and so-called pygmy chimpanzees, also known as bonobos, different species. But of course, they broke apart not that long ago, right? So if in the ape line, if gorillas branched off the line that long ago, humans about 8 million years ago, the bonobos and chimps, they've only been apart about 3 million years. Yet their sexual behaviors are totally different, which is this. Chimpanzees, the males fiercely compete for females, do lots of mate guarding, have huge deposits of semen, and can be incredibly aggressive. But in bonobos, everybody has sex with everybody all the time. whether there's any likelihood of pregnancy or not. And there's both heterosexual couplings and homosexual couplings. And, you know, you'll see things like this of two females simulating. Oh, I forgot the joke I put there. Two females simulating sex, bringing each other to what looks like climax, rubbing their clitorises together, and nobody gets upset about it. Here's another picture, two females. We know they're both females because they have those sexual rubbings. And whereas in chimpanzees, the sexual swellings are only seen when they're likely to get pregnant. In bonobos, the sexual swellings are there lots of times, and there's lots of sex happening all the time, not just during the mating season. And so people have suggested that maybe this species having so much sex means there's much less aggression, less male-male fighting, fewer innocent bystanders getting hurt, et cetera. That you know, the more sex, the better, right? Make love, not war. There may be something to that. Having said all that, I got to send out the warning. I'm not suggesting that any of these animals are thinking anything, but there have been these trends that have been seen, and it's easy to understand how natural selection would favor them. And I'm not going to talk a lot about so-called evolutionary psychology, which is posited on the idea that these same evolutionary forces have favored gene accumulation in humans that make, for example, men more interested in multiple partners than women and things like that. I can easily believe that there are such genes, right? Bless you. But we're not machines, right? Whatever genes you happen to get, you get to decide what your behavior is, and you have to be responsible for your behavior. And so that's why I don't spend lots of times talking about evolutionary psychology. We'll come back to it for a little bit. But for the most part, the problem is there's no way to falsify them, no way to test whether they really are the result of natural selection favoring certain genes or the result of individuals doing what they want to do. And yeah,